The GOP will not stop until it has completely eradicated the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The GOP is fueled by fear. White conservatives are afraid of a black and brown takeover. And their target to stop that takeover is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And they keep hammering it and hammering it and hammering it. So I'm going to explain to you what I'm talking about. Stay with me. Hello, I am Attorney Augustus Corbett, aka the Minister of Justice. I am one half of the Defiant Lawyers. And each and every week we bring you a legal analysis of some trending story having to do with politics, policies, personalities, or pop culture to empower you with the information you need to defy an unjust legal system and to nullify systemic racism. If either of those goals interest you, please subscribe, like, share, and comment, and click the bell so you'll be notified every time we upload one of these powerful and informative videos. So yes, we are experiencing white fear, what one author called white fragility, because we're seeing the GOP target a piece of legislation that used to enjoy bipartisan support, the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 used to receive bipartisan support for the last, over 50 years. But all of a sudden, the GOP fears the Voting Rights Act. Why is that? Again, it's because fear has gripped the GOP. Some years ago, probably in the 1980s, 1990s, a man by the name of Pat Buchanan. I haven't seen Pat Buchanan on the speaking circuit on television here in a while. I don't know if he's still living or not. But he wrote a book, and the book was basically about how whites were losing control of the country because, like Europe, whites were not having as many children as black and brown people. And he was one of many who was pretty much peddling that type of notion. And after a while, it began to take roots, and whites became fearful of this takeover, a takeover that in their minds was occurring on the southern border, and a takeover that was occurring through the electorate. And that really, really hit home with white America with the election and then the re-election of Barack Obama. And today we have a black female vice president. So they're doing everything they can to try to stop this supposed black and brown takeover. And there really isn't some sort of black and brown takeover. That's crazy. That is not what's happening here. Black folk just want full black equality. That's it. But when you've been in power so long, when other folks start talking about full equality, to that group that's used to being in power, that sounds like oppression. So what are they doing? They're going after the Voting Rights Act in the U.S. Supreme Court, in state houses, and they are having some success, unfortunately. In 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down the Shelby County versus Holder case. And there have been several cases since then. I'm going to explain this to you in just a second. But now I want to take the time to talk about the 60th year anniversary of the John F. Kennedy assassination, because the two things are connected: his assassination and the Voting Rights Act. And I just happen to live here in the Dallas area. So I live with the JFK assassination. Now let's go to my iPad here. And today in the Dallas Morning News, the leading newspaper in this area, there is on the front page, yes, a story about his assassination. And it reads, since JFK assassination, no U.S. president has visited Dallas Dealey Plaza. Dealey Plaza is the building where Lee Oswald fired the shot that killed Kennedy. I mean, it's pretty much established that Lee Oswald pulled the trigger and was the guy who shot Kennedy. But the question is, were others involved? That is not something that I'm going to get in today. But what I do want to talk about is how the JFK assassination helped move the civil rights movement forward, in the sense that the civil rights community, after JFK was assassinated, began to think, okay, if we don't get this moving, especially now that he, who was in their mind a friend of the civil rights movement, now that he's gone, is the civil rights movement just going to die because Kennedy has been assassinated? So they felt the need to push along the movement. Now, let's talk about whether Kennedy was a friend or foe of the civil rights movement. Based on my research, he was somewhere in the middle. He wasn't an enemy, he wasn't a foe, but he wasn't a friend either. He was a pragmatist, a politician. He certainly wanted the black vote, but he didn't want to lose the Dixiecrat vote. So I would say, in his mind, the civil rights movement was more of a sort of a nuisance, right? Something that he had to address, but at the same time, he knew there would be consequences if he did address it. Now, the reason why a lot of blacks felt like Kennedy was a friend was because of a phone call that he made. After Dr. King was arrested and put in a Southern jail, obviously his life was in danger. And so Kennedy, I think it was a political move, picked up the phone and called Miss Coretta Scott King and expressed concern over Dr. King. And she said to folks that Kennedy had called her, and to the African American community, that meant that Kennedy was a friend of the civil rights movement from that one phone call. And so much so that I can remember as a young man that there was a picture that all black folks had in their homes, a picture of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Jesus. So he had certainly become a friend, a perceived friend of the black community when he was assassinated. So the civil rights movement said, okay, we need to get this going after Kennedy was in fact assassinated. We know that Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, was Kennedy's vice president. And I think he felt also the need to move the civil rights movement forward as well. Also, the civil rights movement was putting political pressure on Johnson, right, to move the signing various legislation into law, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. And they knew, the civil rights movement knew that it would be Johnson who would sign it into law. So they began to apply political pressure. In fact, he told them, he invited them, I'm for doing this, but make me do it. Use the political process to do it. So King and Roy Wilkins and A.W. Phillips Randolph and several others worked together to get Johnson to sign legislation into law. And it was signed into law. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law. And it did well for the last almost 50 years. The Voting Rights Act basically had bipartisan support. Both Republicans and Democrats saw it as a great moment for the country. and they supported it. Every time it was up for reauthorization, there was not a lot of fanfare about it. But then something happened. What happened? I tell you what happened. And it kind of led up to this. Things kind of built up. In the 1980s and 90s, there was a man named Pat Buchanan, a journalist, I believe he was, an author of a few books. Pat Buchanan was a white supremacist, a right-winger, a very conservative guy. I don't know if Pat is still living or not, but he penned a book about basically whites were losing control of America like whites had done in Europe, because whites were not having as many babies, because of the number of brown people, Latino people coming through the southern border, and because of blacks becoming more and more and more in power. So he wrote that book. The book caught on. And what really sealed and confirmed Buchanan's concerns was the election and the re-election of Barack Obama. Obama was elected into office in 2008. 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a case called Shelby County versus Holder. All right, so let's begin to walk through this, because I'm going to show you the latest case that was handed down that really, if the U.S. Supreme Court upholds this case, the Voting Rights Act is basically dead at that point. Okay, it is hanging by a thread now. But if the U.S. Supreme Court upholds this last case that just came down out of Arkansas, then the Voting Rights Act is pretty much dead. All right. So let's walk through some of these slides that I created. This is sort of a humorous slide here. Brother VRA, Voting Rights Act. And you see he's a big, muscular African-American man, but he's wounded. He has suffered an injury to both legs and to one of his arms. So as strong as he ordinarily would be, he's not as strong as he is today. So again, he is my Voting Rights Act personified image here. And that's exactly where the Voting Rights Act is. It was once strong, but the GOP has severely and seriously weakened it, right? So one leg I have here as Section 4, another leg is Section 5, another leg, Section 2, have all suffered injuries from the GOP. I'll explain what I mean in just a second. Now, let's answer a question that often comes up, especially by disillusioned black voters, who many times tend to be black men. I see it all the time, and I hear it all the time. And it basically questions, what have Democrats done for African Americans? Why vote for Democrats? And for the record, I am not a Democrat, nor am I a Republican. I don't come at this from a partisan position or place. That's not where I'm coming from. I am just a strong supporter of the legal framework that we have in place in this country to protect the rights that we African Americans do have. I know that those rights, those legal rights, hang in the balance. I know as an attorney that the GOP has been chipping away at those rights for decades, and they have really turned it up in the past decade with the election again of Barack Obama and obviously the election of Donald Trump. They are really on what you could describe as warfare against various rights that African Americans desperately need. Civil Rights Act. I mean, we couldn't go to certain restaurants and sleep in certain hotels and so forth without the Civil Rights Act. Without Section 1981, which is a federal law that protects our right to contract, to be treated equitably and fairly by banks, by other establishments. If it wasn't for Section 1981, if it wasn't for Section 1983, the police and law enforcement could treat us any kind of way, could kill us indiscriminately. It's hard, even with Section 1983, to force them to treat us with dignity. But if we didn't have 1983, if we didn't have Section 1981, if we didn't have the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, we would be basically not only disenfranchised, but dehumanized, disregarded in this nation. Those rights, our ancestors fought for those rights, died for those rights. Their lives, their humanity, their families depended on these laws that the GOP is chipping away at. So how white progressives have supported African Americans, often reluctantly. I don't want to look at this from, again, a Democrat and Republican perspective. And the reason I say that is because there was a time in this country when Democrats were our arch enemies. They were called Dixiecrats. The Democrats / Dixiecrats were the ones who fought to preserve the Confederate, were the ones who fought to preserve the Confederacy, slavery, Jim Crow, those Southern Dixiecrats who were Democrats at that time. Because back during slavery, it was the Republican Party that were trying to abolish slavery, that got laws passed, got amendments done of the Constitution. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments were all championed and pushed through by Republicans. But things changed. And those Dixiecrats abandoned the Democrat Party for the Republican Party. And the white progressives who had supported our efforts to end slavery and abolish Jim Crow pretty much, stayed in the Democrat Party or switched to the Democrat Party. So today, the Democrat Party tends to have more of those white progressives who have stood with us over the years, whereas the Republican Party has completely flipped, and the white conservatives, the white supremacists, the white Confederates who have fought everything that we've tried to do are in the Republican Party today. Now, let me say this. I have been a Republican. I have been a Democrat. When I was in college, I was a Democrat and, embraced pretty much all of the Democrat policies. That was probably the first 20 years of my life. And then I switched to the Republican Party, and I was a member of the Republican Party for about 20 years. And that was because of my position, my faith position on issues like abortion and issues like traditional marriage. But that all changed the last 20 years of my life because I just couldn't stomach the white supremacy and the white racism in the Republican Party. I overlooked it for as long as I could because of my firm belief on those two issues I just mentioned, abortion and traditional marriage. But I couldn't continue to stomach it. And I never embraced white supremacy. You have a lot of black conservatives today who literally embrace white supremacy. I never could do that. So I left that party. I left the Republican Party, and I'm today an independent. So I don't want to look at this question of how whites have helped us from a partisan political perspective. I want to look at it from a progressive versus conservative perspective. So white progressives have supported African Americans, as you see here, in that they fought to end slavery and Jim Crow. They fought for the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They fought for the enactment of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I mean, these are really important things. Anyone who has fought to end slavery and Jim Crow and then to get us various rights in the law, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but there were also Civil Rights Act back during Reconstruction that white progressives, white abolitionists fought for us to get. The Fair Housing Act, the white progressives fought for more black elected officials. They fought for Obama's election and re-election. So the first black president of the United States and the first black female vice president, and many other things that they've done. And I read recently that Joe Biden has nominated about 300 black federal judges. That is huge. So white progressives have been in support of our progress forward. Conversely, how have white conservatives fought against African American progress? Well, they fought to preserve the Confederate, slavery, Jim Crow. They fought against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Civil Rights Act back during Reconstruction. They fought against the Voting Rights Act. They fought hard against it. They fought against the Fair Housing Act. They fought against black elected officials. They fought against Barack Obama. They fight, you see the fight that they put up against Kamala Harris. And of course, they fight against the appointment of black judges. They fight against practically every measure of black progress. And you see the faces of some of these people here. These are just representative of the people that we have been fighting for 400 years. Robert E. Lee, Jesse Helms, William Rehnquist, who was the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court for many years, and he opposed Thurgood Marshall, vigorously. Ronald Reagan, probably one of the most racist presidents in my lifetime. Donald Trump is the most racist president in my lifetime. Tucker Carlson, he is a journalist who is always espousing white supremacy and racism. These people are our enemies as African Americans, period. Now, what really freaks me out is when I hear blacks saying that they are supporting the GOP, because these are the people that they are supporting. They are supporting the legacy of Robert E. Lee. They are supporting the legacy, the hateful, racist, white supremacist legacy of Jesse Helms, Strom Thurmond. They are supporting William Rehnquist and all that he did to weaken the law, to weaken the Civil Rights Act, to weaken the Voting Rights Act. All that he did as the Chief Justice to try to turn back the hands of time. All that Ronald Reagan did to oppose and to weaken civil rights laws. All that Donald Trump did. Now, Trump is slick. Trump did a couple things to try to say, hey, I'm with the blacks, like that First Step Act that he did. That was all a trick just to try to get some black voters, black rappers especially. Lil Wayne, Kanye West, Ice Cube, and others. And it worked because the support for the GOP among black men has increased. Here recently, I read. But do they really know who they are aligning themselves with? And do they know that the people that they're aligning themselves with have targeted them more than anyone else? The GOP has targeted black men more than anyone else. And yet you got some of these black guys who are willing to join forces with people who are our sworn enemies. I don't understand that. I don't get that. So let's talk about the GOP's recent assault on the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Well, as I said earlier, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a case called Shelby County versus Holder. Obama was reelected in 2012. This case was handed down in 2013. And let me try to explain briefly what it does or what it did. So the Voting Rights Act, one of the biggest parts of the Voting Rights Act was that it required about 9 states, many of them southern states, to have to get approval from the Department of Justice before they would implement any voting laws. And they had to because of their notorious history of voter suppression. Those were the states that we see videos of their officials putting dogs on blacks and fire hoses on blacks. And when blacks went to vote, they would ask them ridiculous questions like, cite for me the 10th Amendment, or count the number of beans in that jar right there. They would make blacks pay poll taxes, all types of things to prevent blacks from voting. So what those states had to do was submit their proposed voter law to the Department of Justice and get approval first. And if they didn't get approval, then they could not enact those laws. And as a result of that, blacks were able to vote freely for years until 2013, when the court handed down Shelby County versus Holder. That case wiped out the requirement that those southern states have to get pre-clearance or pre-approval before they enact some voting law. And as soon as that case was handed down, states like Texas, North Carolina, Florida, and other states immediately, like the next day, implemented restrictive voting rights laws, voter suppression laws, and racial gerrymandering laws immediately. So that was a big, big blow to the Voting Rights Act, the Shelby County versus Holder case. Also, Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee. This was another case that targeted another section of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2. So with Section 4 and Section 5 now basically gutted from the Shelby County case, the only other section that we could use to protect our voting right was Section 2 and Section 3. I'll talk about Section 3 in just a minute. But Section 2. So Section 2 was what we was left with after 2013. Well, again, the Brnovich v. Democratic National Committee case was handed down in 2021, and it weakened Section 2. So you see the planned, targeted attack on the piece of legislation that has helped us overcome some level of white supremacy and have gotten us in places where we could be at the table helping make decisions. They've targeted that piece of legislation by just knocking out various sections. With Shelby County, they knocked out Section 4 and 5. With Brnovich, they knocked out or they weakened Section 2. Now, in the past couple of days, another case has come out from the 8th Circuit. The 8th Circuit is the appellate court that is over a particular district here in this country, and it is right under. These judges are right under the Supreme Court. And what they say for that particular district becomes the law for that district, especially if the U.S. Supreme Court does not hear the appeal that's surely to come from this newest case. This newest case is the Arkansas State Conference of the NAACP versus the Arkansas Board of Apportionment. It was literally just handed down November 20th, just 3 days ago or 2 days ago. And basically what it says, as you see here, it says that private citizens cannot sue a state or a local voting district or some local official who has implemented some voter suppression law. A private person cannot sue that person or that district or the state. They must look to the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney General, to bring the lawsuit. So if you and or I or some other African-American person, if we believe that we had been discriminated against by a local voting district or a local voting official or by the state, we cannot, if we live in this district, we cannot bring a lawsuit ourselves. We must ask the Attorney General of the United States of America to bring the lawsuit on our behalf. Good luck with that. We should be able to walk into a federal district court and bring the lawsuit ourselves instead of having to wait to see if the Department of Justice will take up the case or not. That is crazy. And it's their attempt to completely eradicate the last remaining section. There is Section 3. I'll talk about Section 3 in just a minute. But the last most potent section to stop voter suppression. I mean, they don't quit. They keep going after sections of the Voting Rights Act because of this fear I talked about earlier. So this case was just handed down, I believe, November 20th. And once again, it says that private plaintiffs, private parties, you and me, or organizations like the NAACP who represent private parties cannot bring a lawsuit based on Section 2. Now, the serious thing about that is Section 2 is what we have left now that SCOTUS gutted Sections 4 and 5. So Section 2 was what we had left. And now they're going after that. They don't quit. So here's the case. Arkansas State Conference, NAACP versus Arkansas Board of Apportionment. It simply says, did Congress give private plaintiffs the ability to sue under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act? Text and structure reveal that the answer is no. So we affirm the district court's decision to dismiss. Briefly, what that means is the NAACP there in Arkansas sued on behalf of some Black citizens, sued the state of Arkansas because of racial gerrymandering. Racial gerrymandering is when a state draws up a voting map that basically dilutes Black votes. So the NAACP in the state of Arkansas sued the state of Arkansas and said this is a violation of the Voting Rights Act. The district judge, the lower judge, said, well, first of all, you all cannot sue because you're private plaintiffs. You're being represented by the NAACP, but the NAACP is suing on your behalf, you private plaintiffs. And Section 2 does not give you standing to bring this lawsuit. So I'm dismissing your lawsuit. The Eighth Circuit agreed with the district court and said, he's right. You do not have standing to bring this lawsuit under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, again, keep in mind, SCOTUS already gutted Section 4 and 5, which were the most potent and powerful defense to voter suppression. Section 2 was what we had left, and now they're saying we can't sue as private citizens, as private plaintiffs. We can't sue under Section 2. So they are totally, completely eradicating the Voting Rights Act. Now, I kept alluding to Section 3. Section 3 of the Voting Rights Act does give a judge the authority to require a state to get pre-approval from the judge or from the AG's office before they implement a voting law. Section 3 does that, but it's much weaker than Section 5. It requires, first of all, that you convince a judge. Well, good luck with that. Some of these judges have been appointed by Trump and Reagan and Bush, etc. And so it's not the easiest thing to get them to see things your way because of their particular worldview. Whereas that was not the case with Section 4 and 5, because those attorneys in the Justice Department in the Civil Rights Division, they knew what voting discrimination looked like, and they were pretty much on guard for it and were ready to address those things using the Voting Rights Act. So compare those career civil rights attorneys in the Department of Justice with a district judge. That does not guarantee that you're going to get any sort of redress or any sort of relief using Section 3. And Section 3 also says that the judge can only require pre-clearance for a certain amount of time. And most importantly, it requires that the plaintiff show that there was discriminatory intent, intentional discrimination. That is hard. That is very difficult to show that this was intentional discrimination. I mean, oftentimes you can just look at the results of a law or policy and just see, for example, that it has resulted in less black folks voting, or it has weakened the black vote in a particular state. Well, that's not good enough when you have to show discriminatory intent. I mean, you almost have to show a person's heart. I mean, all they got to do is say, that was not my intent. So Section 3 is there, but it's not as potent and powerful as Section 4 and 5. What's the solution as I come to a close? The solution is for Congress to change the Voting Rights Act, to make the changes that SCOTUS said it needs before it can be constitutional. So Congress needs to act. Congress needs to fix the problems in the Voting Rights Act. But we know Congress is divided. We know a lot of white conservatives, the people that I told you earlier who fight against all of our progress, are blocking any sort of fixes for the Voting Rights Act, which again is weird because for the last 50 or so years, the Voting Rights Act has enjoyed bipartisan support. But in this particular political climate, not anymore, because they perceive the Voting Rights Act as their arch enemy. So they are fighting it and trying to weaken it on every level. So that brings me to us, African Americans, voting. We must vote to get people in office who will fix the Voting Rights Act. And don't you dare sit there and think and say, well, what's the use of voting? That is a crazy question. That is a crazy question, folks. Our country is a democratic republic. We get to say who we want representing us, who we want sitting at the table, expressing what we want and desire as a group of people. We get the chance to do that. So we want the people sitting at the table and in Congress and in the White House and on the courts and locally in the DA's office, in the sheriff's office, in the county register of deeds office, and every other office. We want the people who have our best interests at heart. And the only way that we can do that is by voting. Voting has direct consequences on our lives. And so it's so distressing to see oftentimes how in a particular jurisdiction, African Americans did not turn out. African Americans did not show up. There are some states that have a large black population, yet they don't vote. There are some counties that are majority black, yet the people who run the county are white. There are some cities, especially in the South, where a majority of the people are black or nearly black, yet the whole city council is white. Explain that. Explain that, if you will. Well, it's black folks not voting. And then saying, how does voting help me? Well, it gives you and puts you in a position to choose your leader, who hopefully will have, again, what's best for you in their minds and hearts. We can't just sit back and allow folks that we know don't want us to progress in seats of power because we're not voting. We must vote. That's what I want to leave you with. Again, I'm Attorney Augustus Corbett, one half of the Defiant Lawyers. We bring you this sort of information on a weekly basis to empower you to defy a legal system that is against us, and to empower you to nullify white supremacy. That is our commitment. We are lawyers. We do more than civil rights law. I'm going to do a video on that coming up. We do, for example, criminal defense, personal injury, family law. But our contribution to the community is to bring you this information. That's one of our contributions, is to bring you this information so that you can fight the good fight for full equality. All right? So thank you for tuning in. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell. Until the next time, thank you. Peace.